We want the best for our children. Adults talk at length about the things that harm children and what we should do about them to protect our children. It's well-intentioned discussion, and many people put in Herculean effort to do important and beneficial things for children. But absent a working knowledge of the empirical data on what actually harms children the most frequently and severely, many efforts on the part of very well-intentioned adults may fall short. So let's talk about what harms children in the United States. Now, I must say, this will be an uncomfortable topic for many of you, but I assure you it is based on the best available empirical data, much of which comes from the most recent edition of the text, The Sociology of Childhood, that sociologist Bill Corsaro and I co-authored together. Let's start with the really ugly stuff. What kills children the most frequently in the United States, and how has that changed in recent years? I should say from the outset that generally speaking, children are relatively safe in the United States. But nonetheless, it's important to know what poses the most serious threats to their safety. I'm going to bracket mental health issues for this discussion, though there has been an alarming increase in mental health problems for kids, especially teenagers and young adults. We'll get into that issue in another episode because it merits attention on its own. So here are the top 3 things that kill children, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Number 1, firearm incidents. That's right. Guns kill children between the ages of 1 and 19 more frequently than anything else in our country. That's relatively new. For many, many years, it was car accidents that were the most frequent cause of death for children. Not anymore. It's firearm incidents. That includes many different scenarios. It can be mass shootings and gun violence that's all too common in many communities, all of which are horrifically tragic, but it also includes accidents with guns and suicides. But they all involve guns. Make no mistake, in the wealthiest country in the world, guns kill our children more frequently than anything else, with a 33% increase in the rate of child firearm homicides between 2019 and 2020. Number 2, car accidents. As I mentioned, for a long time, this was the most frequent cause of death. It's only been in the last few years that car accidents got superseded by firearm incidents. And a big reason for this is a large decline in the rate of child deaths due to car accidents. Despite this positive downward trend, car accidents remain one of the most routine threats to children's collective safety. Number 3, drug overdoses and poisoning. This one has also spiked in frequency in recent years, according to CDC data. A great many families have powerfully addictive pills in one or more cabinets somewhere in the house. In addition, over the last 2 decades, the prescriptions of opioid pain relievers for people among many ages has exploded. Child deaths due to drugs and poisoning increased by more than 80% from 2019 to 2020. So these are the extremes, the things that kill children. But there are other things that are still harmful to children that don't kill them, at least not initially. Poverty is a big one. The lack of housing and food for children in this country is staggering. Matthew Desmond, a sociologist at Princeton University, has a recent book out that paints a very vivid picture of how brutally difficult poverty can be for people, including children. Now, we could address this, and in fact, we have in recent years. Desmond estimates that it would take the United States roughly $177 billion to move everyone in the U.S. over the poverty line. To put this in perspective, the Department of Defense requested a budget of almost 5 times that amount, $842 billion, for the 2024 fiscal year alone. But much more modest policies can do wonders to alleviate children's exposure to poverty. As part of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, there was an expanded child tax credit. That single piece of legislation reduced child poverty to 5.2%, which was by far the lowest child poverty rate in U.S. history. It usually hovers at or above 15%. That was just a tax credit. It wasn't socialism. We didn't become a Scandinavian country with similar tax rates. It was a tax credit, and it dramatically reduced the number of children who suffered in poverty, at least for a while, until we just let it expire at the end of 2022. We just let it go away. And not surprisingly, child poverty rates climb again. Another unfortunately common problem for kids is the abuse they suffer in the home. But we don't attend to this very accurately. For instance, we have the very important Amber Alert system that blasts alarms to everyone with a cell phone, TV, computer, or radio when a child is abducted. Now, this is important, of course, and it results in the recovery and protection of many children who find themselves in threatening situations. But what about kids who run away from home? They do this of their own volition, often to escape abusive homes. As my colleague and co-author Bill Corsaro has written, quote, Amber Alerts would be shown in the background of television shows 24 hours a day if we considered runaway children a major problem in the United States, end quote. So these are things that are really harmful to children: guns, cars, drugs, poverty, and abuse. But here's the thing. Kids don't produce these problems. Adults do. I'm reminded of a conversation I have with my own children at times. Who is responsible for virtually all forms of warfare in human history? Kids or adults? Adults. Who created and enforced all forms of slavery? Kids or adults? Adults. Who created and used all existing forms of nuclear weapons? Kids or adults? Adults. Who has done more to contribute to climate change? Kids or adults? Adults. We could go on. Now, I do not in any way mean to suggest that children don't exert their own agency. They absolutely do, as documented in detail by brilliant sociologists like Bill Corsaro, Jess Calarco, Gary Fine, C.J. Pascoe, and Barry Thorne. And kids engage in problematic behaviors, to be sure. Do some kids bully each other at times? Of course. But does that make them different from adults? Not at all. Do some kids lie, cheat, steal, and try to get away with it? Of course. But does that make them different from adults? Not at all. Do some kids get irritable and lash out when they get interrupted or when they don't get what they want? Of course. But does that make them different from adults? Not at all. Do some kids obnoxiously seek attention and constant accommodations from authority figures in their lives? Of course. But does that make them different from adults? Not at all. Do some kids engage in sexual harassment and bigotry? Of course. But does that make them different from adults? Not at all. None of this is to say that these behaviors are okay. They're not. But not only do many adults engage in the same behavior, they often model it to children. Now think about these questions, though. Do kids manufacture and profit from the sale of guns and pass laws concerning the availability of guns, or rather refuse to pass laws limiting gun availability? Not very often. Does that make them different from adults? Yes. It also gets them killed. Do kids drive cars in ways that are reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible? Sometimes, yes. Does that make them different from adults? Not necessarily. It also gets them killed. Do kids run big pharma, or the international drug trade, or write prescriptions that make addictive drugs as accessible in many households as a pack of Skittles? Not very often. Does that make them different from adults? Yes. It also gets them killed. The kids themselves, very often, are all right, but the things that most frequently harm them are very often not their doing. If we're really serious about the health, safety, and well-being of children, it's the adults in their lives that are much more likely to be the source of the problem than they are. Until we recognize that and acknowledge the empirical data, the things that harm kids the most will keep harming them.